Welcome to today's CRP webinar. I'm Sarah Klein. I'm an economist at the Farm Service Agency, and we're happy today to have Ray Powers and Mace Vaughn here to talk about interseeding, bringing flower diversity back to CRP grasslands for the benefit of pollinators. Ray Powers is a Farm Bill pollinator conservation planner and Xerces NRCS partner biologist located in Lincoln, Nebraska. Ray works with farmers, agencies, and conservation groups to promote pollinators and other beneficial insects on farms. In collaboration with NRCS staff, she works with farmers to identify pollination and pest control needs and determine strategies and funding sources to best meet those needs. She provides technical support to hundreds of farmers, NRCS staff, and other farm agency professionals across Nebraska and the Northern Plains as she navigates questions about pollinator habitat needs, plant selection, site preparation, and monitoring. And our second speaker today is Mace Vaughn. He serves as the Xerces Society Pollinator Conservation Program Co-Director and also as a partner biologist and pollinator conservation specialist with the NRCS West National Technology Support Center in Portland, Oregon. He has led the pollinator conservation program since 2003. During his tenure at Xerces, the pollinator program has grown from a small pilot project on California farms to a national multi-million-dollar program implementing pollinator conservation projects across the U.S. Helping to oversee a team of 24 pollinator conservation specialists and several consultants across the U.S., Mace now helps to manage the largest pollinator conservation team in the country. So our presentation today will be about 40 minutes with around 20 minutes for questions at the end. If you would like to ask a question, please note that there's a chat box in the lower left of the screen. You can type your question there and the speakers will address them at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mace to begin the presentation.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that. Appreciate that introduction. And it'll be good to actually, we'll get a sense of this here in a second. So let's see. Let me just move on to our next slide. For those of you who don't know Xerces, I just wanted to give you a quick background on the Xerces Society. We're a conservation nonprofit that's been around since 1971, doing conservation planning, education, research, restoration, advocacy, et cetera, to protect invertebrates and the habitats that they support, as well as the ecosystem services, crop pollination, pest management, and these sorts of things that are important for farms and rangeland and homeowner gardens, et cetera. As Sarah mentioned, we now have a team of staff in the pollinator program that are spread all across the country, in Nebraska with Ray, but Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and several other states from coast to coast. And a lot of the work that we do in the pollinator program involves a really tight collaboration with the USDA, especially the Natural Resources Conservation Service, where we bring an expertise in pollinator biology and ecology, restoration, crop management, pest management, et cetera, to really help farmers and ranchers and others manage their land for pollinator conservation. I'm noticing in the question box that some folks have maybe had some trouble with audio, but I'll be able to get a sense of that with our next slide here. One thing that would really be helpful for Ray and I is just to have a quick sense of kind of who all is in the audience. And just skimming over the names, I notice a real diversity of folks from a wide variety of affiliations. And to see if everyone's able to hear okay, would you all please fill out this poll that I just pulled up. This is a new thing for me to try here, so bear with me. I'd love for you to check what your primary affiliation is. Are you with a Farm Service Agency, NRCS, conservation districts? Are you a farmer or rancher, conservation NGO, researcher, et cetera? Oh, look, we're getting lots of responses in. Great. That suggests to me that people can actually hear what's going on. All right. Yeah, I'm going to wait a second here to let you all see that. All right. Not bad. So of the 90 folks or so who are logged on, we've got about 60, 65, coming up on 70 responses. It looks like we're an interesting mix, heavily leaning towards NRCS and conservation NGOs, as well as several researchers on board. That's fantastic. Okay, great. That really helps me out. Yeah, excellent. All right. I wonder how this works if I skip to results. I'm going to close that poll now and see. Oh, look at that. And everybody can see a nice bar chart. This is high tech. This is advanced webinaring. Great. So you can get a sense of who all you are listening with right now. Appreciate you all doing that. And with that, let's kind of dig into the content here. For today, my role in this is just going to be able to give you all sort of an overview on kind of the context for why we're talking about interseeding. I want to talk about, at least in the context of pollinators. I'll quickly hit on their importance and their decline, talk a bit about the importance of maintaining diverse wildflower stands, and then I'll be turning it over to Ray so that she can really walk you all through the interseeding process and the work that we went through to pull together these recommendations and these guidelines. We'll wrap up with a couple of slides on where to go for more information and a short talk on programs and practices, or just a slide or two on programs, USDA conservation programs and practices, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So as Sarah mentioned, please be sure to type questions into the comment or the chat field, and those will get funneled up to us, and we'll be able to tackle those at the end of the show. So with that, let's just hit on just a big picture. So a lot of you probably already know this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, pollinators are important. They're really important. More than 85% of flowering plants need an animal, these are mostly insects, to move pollen from flower to flower, and in so doing facilitate production of seeds, fruits, and the reproduction of those plants. And if we think about this in the context of our food systems and human nutrition, 35% of crop production worldwide is either totally or significantly dependent upon pollinators to be for maximum production. This is about $18 to $27 billion worth of crops grown in the U.S., or $235 to $577 billion of crops worldwide. And I think it's always important to realize this is money that's just paid to those farmers, to those producers to grow those crops. They then go into bigger market systems where they're converted into other products, or they're sold, to the consumer at an even higher rate, and it's just even a bigger part of the overall economy. I also think it's important for people to realize that most of our vitamins and minerals come from insect-pollinated plants. So we get lots of calories from corn and soy and wheat and rice, but when it comes to those nutrients, fruits and vegetables, seeds, etc., those are where we get the bulk of our nutrients. And, these animals are also critically important for wildlife. When we think about birds, when we think about mammals, fruits and seeds that are the result of pollination are a major part of the diet of many birds and animals. Pollinators themselves are a critical source of food for wildlife. They are representative of other insects and invertebrates. As one quick example, 89% of bird species in the United States totally rely on invertebrates during at least one of their life stages in order to be reproductive, to produce the most chicks and to grow. And if you think about that pollinator habitat where we have a diversity of plants and flowers and diversity of architecture with wildflowers and shrubs and trees and all these different habitat components, if we have all this together for pollinators, we're really supporting the diversity of wildlife. So really those pollinator habitat itself is really supportive of other wildlife. And there's a whole variety of insect pollinators that we target when we think about pollinator conservation and habitat management. We've got, let's see if I get my pointer. We've got butterflies, flies, we've got moths, wasps, beetles, and then we've got bees. And if we're thinking about the service of crop pollination, bees are really where it's at. These are our most important pollinators. I think from my perspective, it's always useful to think about why that is. Unlike all those other pollinators, all those other flower visitors, bees actively collect and move. They transport pollen. Almost all those other insects feed primarily on nectar. They're visiting those flowers for energy, to keep them going. And it's really important for them, to do that, to be able to lay the most eggs, to reproduce most successfully. But it's bees that are really using the full extent of those flowers and really getting into that pollen. Bees are also not stupid. They learn how to work those flowers to gather that pollen and nectar, and as such, they exhibit a behavior called flower constancy, where they move from one flower of the same species to the next, generally speaking. So they'll visit a rose, followed by a rose, followed by a rose, after they figure out how to get that pollen and nectar, which makes them obviously really good foragers, really good pollinators of a particular species at one time. And they also forage in the area around the nest. So if we create nests, if we manage for nests, if you're a beekeeper or we work with beekeepers, you put a honeybee hive down, you put a nest down in one place, then those bees will stay in that area and focus on pollinating the plants, the crops, whatever it might be in the area around that nest. But as many of you, I'm sure, are well aware, we've seen significant declines in the numbers of managed and wild pollinators. And this has been significantly in the news, certainly for the last, say, 10, 15 years, but something that people have been concerned about, something that Xerces has been concerned about going back to the mid-1980s. A recent global analysis suggests that more than 40% of invertebrate pollinator species across the world are facing some risk of extinction, particularly bees and butterflies. So this is obviously concerning. If you look in the United States, or if you look in North America, at the bee species for which we have the most information, that being our bumblebees, these are critical pollinators of crops and wildflowers. They also are an important example of a relatively well-studied group of native bees. An analysis of the 50 or more bumblebee species in North America pretty clearly shows that 28% of those species are in some sort of International Union of Conservation Nations red list threatened category, either critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. So we've got pretty clear evidence that our bumblebee species are facing some significant challenges. Butterflies too. Going back several years now, looking at NatureServe data, more than 17% of North American butterfly species are at some risk of extinction, and this includes both habitat specialists as well as formerly common and widespread species. There's evidence from California that even the pest species, the cabbage white, is in decline. Certainly it's gotten the most attention recently with the monarch butterfly, a species that's broadly distributed, that still occurs in the millions of individuals, but a population, if we look just at the eastern population, a population that's seen an 84% decline from highs in the early to mid-1990s. So we've got these general declines happening with our native species that we know about here across North America. And we can't forget honeybees. The European honeybee is our most important, most familiar commercial crop pollinator. When I first started in beekeeping in the early 90s, beekeepers typically lost less than 15% of their bees per year. It usually was down in the 9 or 10%, if that. Between 1995 and 2006, when the varroa mite hit pretty hard, here's a varroa mite up here on the back of this bee. When the varroa mite hit pretty hard, beekeepers started losing 15 to 22%. That was considered, kind of barely sustainable. But after 2006, or around that time, we had the introduction of colony collapse disorder, which, although we don't see colony collapse disorder any longer or very much in honeybees right now, beekeepers today are still losing 22 to 45% of their hives per year. And that is definitely not sustainable. At the same time that beekeepers are having these challenges, the Farm Service Agency and the NRCS have been funding research being conducted by folks at the U.S. Geologic Survey, Clint Otto, Matthew Smart, and others to try to understand what's been going on with a forb-rich conservation reserve program ground in the northern Great Plains. So if you look at this map of North Dakota and South Dakota, based on research that team just recently published in the National Academy of Sciences, it's pretty clear to see where all that red is significant losses in CRP. So the Great Plains are a critical, in this case the northern Great Plains, a critical honeybee resting ground and honey producing area. and they have seen documented significant loss of CRP acres, which means that those remaining CRP acres really need to be as nectar and pollen rich as possible in order to help sustain beekeepers, beekeeping, as well as a whole host of native pollinator species that live in these different landscapes, which really gets at the heart of what we're talking about today and why it's so important. So what can we do to help? Fundamentally, what we can do to help is to get wildflowers as much as we can back into these landscapes where they belong, where they've occurred in the past. And this means actively working to protect, to manage, to enhance, and restore habitats where these plants and pollinators can survive and thrive. In the context of this presentation, we'll be focusing more on sort of open natural areas, but this even applies to our backyards and gardens, etc. So ideally, we need to be protecting and managing existing habitat out there to maximize its quality for pollinators, for wildflower and plant diversity. And this might be in land enrolled in CRP or other conservation programs. This might be native range or prairie pockets or old fields or pivot corners and field margins, a whole host of areas that might have pretty decent cover. Maybe there's even really good native grass cover, but into which we would like to see more wildflowers. And ideally, we're focusing, initially and first and foremost on opportunities to better manage this existing habitat for the benefit of pollinators and the benefit of wildflower diversity. This really should be our first consideration to really improve both that wildflower abundance and pollinator quality. In some cases, that management alone can restore or increase wildflower diversity. And if we want to do this, we're really aiming at timing management for when it's most effective against target dominating grasses or target weeds, or if not then during that dormant season for wildflowers, so that we can minimize negative impacts on those wildflowers. Any of these management practices need to account for sufficient recovery time, and if we're working on managing relatively high quality habitat, ideally we're disturbing no more than a third of that area each year to allow for pollinator refuges around those disturbed areas. For example, if we run a burn through, ideally we're only burning a third or less of a habitat area so that that surrounding landscape can help in the recolonization of that new habitat in case we've burned out and killed the pollen, the bees and butterflies, et cetera, that are on site. But frankly, sometimes management's not going to do the job. There's either no viable wildflower seed bank, or maybe it's previously cropped or CRP ground that's now so dominated by grasses that there's just not a hope of those wildflowers really jumping out without some significant hope, some significant help. And this is when we start to think about interceding in that interceding process. And here I want to turn it over to Ray to really get at the heart of what this webinar is about, that interceding process. So with that, Ray, I'm going to flip it to the next slide and hand the reins over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mace. That was great. I think before I get started, just kind of thinking about using management to increase wildflower diversity, I want to make one important point about native range. And there might be some circumstances on native rangeland or remnant prairie where management really isn't increasing wildflower diversity, and interceding might be an option. But we just want to really advocate for the use of regional experts in that situation and making sure you're selecting the correct species and the correct source for those seeds. So really reaching out to our local experts in that case. And we'll be talking a little bit more about some of those circumstances where we're coming into fields that were probably previously cropped and had some seed planted on them. Just wanted to make that point before we get started. So with that, hi guys, I'm Ray. Let's get started. So what is interceding? I think this is really a process. It's not a passive act of just adding seed to a site, but it really is a process of prepping that site and managing it with the goal of adding diversity to a site with already existing vegetation through the addition of seed. It might also be called overseeding or referred to as overseeding. And there's a few important things to think about that we'll talk a lot more about in the next 20 minutes. Thinking about getting that litter removed from the site before we're adding seeds. It's really a process, most importantly probably, of vegetation suppression of that existing vegetation both before and after we're adding that seed. And I think a really important point also is that we are really thoughtful and careful in our selection of the species that we're putting down on the site. So selecting the correct species for the site is a really important part of interseeding. Having said that, I think there's lots of people that have been interseeding successfully, and we talked to lots of them, but I think there are situations where interseeding is not the right fit, and you're not going to have success, or it's going to be a lot of time, effort, and money to have success interseeding. A couple of those situations would be if you have a really high noxious weed pressure, and that's kind of directed more toward our broadleaf weeds. When we start suppressing that grass vegetation, that's really going to give a chance for those weeds to really flourish and grow. So if you've got high weed pressure, propagular pressure from those weeds, this might be a situation where you just think about completely eradicating the vegetation you have, dealing with your weed issue, and starting with a clean slate for that seed. Also, there are some species of particularly non-native cool season grasses that when they are very dominant on a site can be really difficult to kind of break that dominance and get some seedlings established and maintained through time. Particularly reed canary grass is one where if you have 100% cover, that's a situation you just might want to nuke it to get some of that wildflower diversity back on site. Smooth brown can be a tricky one, crested wheatgrass, tall fescue, I'm sure there are others. So those are some situations when you might just think about doing a complete restoration on site as opposed to suppressing your existing vegetation and adding seed. As Mace mentioned, this is all part of the development of a pretty extensive guidelines on interseeding, mostly in the Midwest and the Northern Great Plains were the regions we targeted, and also a shorter brochure. These will be available shortly, and I think Mace will touch on that at the end of this talk where we can find those. These were developed from a review of published restoration research and also a lot from survey responses that we got from around, I think it was somewhere between 25 and 30 land managers, researchers, and landowners. I will refer to them as practitioners hereafter to save time. And if any of them are in the audience today, thank you so much. It was really helpful to have your feedback and continuing discussions about what has worked for you and what hasn't worked for you. And they all had experience with interseeding. Almost all of them were successful with interseeding. I think collectively they had interseeded successfully, over 1,000 acres of private and public lands. So they really have a rich history of doing interseeding and doing it well. They came from a variety of states in the Midwest and mostly the Northern Great Plains. So here's kind of a roadmap of where I want to go with you guys in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So we'll start with some key considerations to think about before you start the interseeding process, walk through the nitty-gritty details of the interseeding process. If we have time, we'll look at some strategies, actually specific techniques that some of our practitioners had given us from the field. I'll touch really briefly on kind of ongoing management to maintain that diversity. And at that point, I'll kick it back to Mace, and he'll give us a little highlight of NRCS opportunities and some additional resources. So let's dive right in. So a less fancy way of saying key considerations is what's already there. When we go out on the site, what are we seeing? And then some important things to look for, take note of, are grass phenology. So what type of grasses are on site? What's the site like that you're looking at? What's the soil type, drainage class, landscape position? Are we on the top of a hill, rocky soils, or down in a bottom wetland? Thinking about species selection, and that's referring actually to the wildflower species seed that we're going to put down. What's available, what's right for the site? We also want to definitely look at those invasive weeds that are on and around our site. Think about litter management, and finally that wild card of precipitation in the first years of the growing season for our interseeding process. So we'll walk through each of these considerations and talk about what to look for and think about. So when we're talking about grass phenology, we'll start here with cool season grasses. Start with the worst. So cool season grasses, actively growing in the spring and fall. For my region, they're mostly non-native species, and those tend to be the ones that we really want to be looking out for and watching for. They might have been pasture or turf grasses that were previously planted for forage. Many of them are sod forming, and they probably require the highest level of grass suppression before you want to do any interseeding into these types of sites. So species that you might be seeing are smooth brome, Kentucky blue, reed canary grass, and tall fescue. And I think there's kind of thresholds for each of those species on site where you might think about starting over for any of those, as opposed to doing some suppression and kind of pushing back against those cool season grass species. If you have a site dominated by warm season grasses, at least in the Midwest and northern Great Plains, you're in a pretty good place to do interseeding. This is where you want to be. So these guys are actively growing during the summer, that growing season. Typically native species, although there are some non-native, especially as you move south, that might be more of a problem. They could be remnant or planted, typically bunch grasses, although not always, and they can require some grass suppression. A lot for those species that aren't bunch grasses are where we see most of that grass suppression being needed. So these are things like big blue, Indian grass, switchgrass, little blue stem. And so if you've got a site dominated by these guys, you're in pretty good shape and definitely want to think about interseeding. You might also run into the circumstance where you have both types of grasses on site, where you're looking at both cool season and warm season grasses. So you're really having grass growth and competition spring, summer, and fall. And this might be a mix of native species and introduced species. They might be remnant, they might be planted. You might have bunch grasses and sod formers. And you're probably going to need to do some grass suppression and think about the timing of that grass suppression across the entire growing season and spring and fall. But you might have a little bit better luck, a little more space to work with than you would if it was just completely dominated by introduced cool grasses. So you can see on that photo on the right, we've got some nice warm season bunch grasses that are green and actively growing, and then a little bit of a matrix of cheatgrass that is senescing now in the summertime. In the photo on the left, we have Canada wild rye, which is a native cool season grass, and you might notice that big blue stem seed head in the front there, so we've got some big blue stem there. So these situations too, you probably are going to be able to interseed successfully. When we're thinking about the role of interseeding, and I've kind of been saying these things already, really our best case is going to be those native warm season bunch grasses. If that's what's dominant, move forward. As we're moving east into some of our more productive grasses, that's when we need to start thinking more about grass suppression techniques and management before we start interseeding. Then when we hit those non-native cool season grasses, smooth brome, Kentucky blue, switchgrass, that's when it starts to get challenging to be interseeding, when we have some of that on site. And nearly all of the practitioners we talked to were pretty adamant that a reed canary grass stand was a complete renovation situation. So we want to be really aware of the invasive weeds on site. As I mentioned before, they really need control before interseeding and even before you want to think about grass suppression. When you release those weeds, when you do grass suppression, you're just releasing those weeds and weed seeds that you probably have in the seed bank if those weeds are on site. So you just need to be really cognizant of the pressures of those invasive weeds, both before, during, and after we're interseeding. They are completely able to outcompete those interseeded wildflowers, so that continued maintenance of weed control is essential when you've interseeded a site. And again, if you've got pretty high invasive weed pressure, complete restoration just might be more efficient for you and more cost effective in the long run. We also want to think about that litter that's on site, that duff, that previous year's material that we have on site, because when we put those seeds down, whether we're broadcasting or drilling that seed, we really need to make good seed soil contact. Also, once those seeds have germinated, we want to make sure they have as much access to the sunlight as possible. So some techniques to get rid of litter are burning, haying, and grazing. We'll talk more about that in the coming slides. Typically, you want to make sure you've got really, really good litter management when you're broadcast seeding especially. So thinking about where you're at on the landscape, what kind of issues you're going to be dealing with. Are you going to have continual weed seed deposition because you're in a low fertile bottomland, or you're going to be dealing with low fertility site up on a hillside, and taking that into account both when we're doing site selection and as we're going through getting ready to interseed and managing afterwards. The practitioners that we talked to overwhelmingly advocated for native species to be planted into these grass stands, and making sure that you're careful in your selection and you choose species that thrive in similar environments. And since we want to be helping all those pollinators, bees and butterflies throughout the entire season, being careful to choose species that are blooming in different seasons. So those spring, summer, fall, we're all familiar with making sure we hit all of those bloom times. Also, if you are dealing with a stand that is missing a component of that ecological system, consider going ahead and interseeding, maybe some native cool season grasses or sedges as well to kind of round out that ecosystem and make it a little less susceptible to weed invasion in the future, was another point that they made. USDA Plants is a wonderful resource, as is the Biota of North America, to figure out what's native both to your state and your county and what's going to work on site. Additionally, if there's some nearby diverse restorative remnant sites that have wildflower diversity, that's a good guide to go to and see what's thriving, what's doing well, and use that as a guide in making your plant decisions. I will say that in the document we have a list of, I think, around 80 species that have been successfully interseeded in the Midwest and the Great Plains. So that'll be available in the document. So those are species that tend to establish quickly and are a little competitive. So those are great species to interseed. And precipitation. So you have no control over this, but it's always nice to go ahead and look at what your drought outlook for the first growing season after you've interseeded is. Drought can really impact the success of your interseeding, especially in that first year. For those practitioners that had drought in the first year, it wasn't a complete failure, as what we heard, that then in that second growing season or when some rainfall returned to the area, they've got some establishment. It just took a little bit longer. So those seeds were laying dormant during the drought and then germinating when they got to the right conditions. So just being aware of kind of what's on the forecast and using that in your decision making is always a good idea. All right, guys, through the first one. So those are the main things you want to be thinking about when you're thinking of interseeding. And now we'll just dive into the interseeding process. So it's really a three-step process, as we've already mentioned several times. You want to think about, prior to interseeding, suppressing that highly competitive vegetation, so those grasses and those weeds, and also managing your litter. For the actual interseeding acts, we'll talk about seeding methods, rates, and timing. And then you want to continue that management in the first and sometimes the second growing season after those seeds are down with your seedling establishment management. So here are several management strategies, disturbance strategies used for that, for both pre-seeding and after seeding management. I will mention here that most practitioners did not recommend using disking as a strategy for pre-seeding management. So we didn't include that, and we don't recommend that because of the ability of weed seeds to colonize those disc areas and also messing with soil biology. So we really looked at herbicide, grazing, burning, haying, and mowing as our strategies to do both grass suppression and weed control and litter management. And here I'll just point out that if you're doing mowing or herbicide, you want to think about using a different strategy also to get litter off the site if that's a concern. So before interseeding, using herbicides can be a really effective technique. At this point in the process, you can use a non-selective herbicide, and glyphosate was definitely the most mentioned herbicide used in this stage. That's really if you don't have any wildflower, any diversity on site that you're interested in keeping. You just really want to suppress those grasses. That's a cheap way to do it. You can also move to a grass-selective herbicide at this point if you do have some wildflowers that you want to keep on site. Clethodim and cefoxidim were the most often used grass-selective herbicides. With those cool season grasses, you want to get at least 2 applications and time those for when the grasses are vulnerable. So when those grasses are really in their active growing stage. Typically with the warm season grasses, we're seeing 1 application as being successful in suppressing those grasses and allowing a little space for our wildflowers. Herbicides are great for invasive weed species control and using those to get rid of weeds on site. And again, you're going to need to find another way to manage your litter if you're using strictly herbicides for site prep. Grazing is another great strategy. Lots of cow photos. And I snuck in a bison. Using cattle or bison, you really want to target when those grasses are growing, just like with herbicides. Grazing is nice because it can be a form of continual disturbance, so they're just kind of continually pushing those back against those grasses for as long as they're on site. And when you're thinking about getting a site ready for interseeding, you want to maybe think about a higher rate or a more intense grazing regime than you typically would, because you really want to knock those grasses back and get them to give up a little bit of the root space. So putting some cattle out for maybe an entire growing season at a bit higher rate than you would before you want to interseed. Burning, haying, and mowing have all also been used. And again, we want to use these and time them to suppress the dominant grasses. They're often used in tandem with herbicide, grazing, or both. Unless you're mowing or haying repeatedly, these really represent a one-time disturbance. So you want to make sure you're targeting this to do grass suppression or litter management, and maybe getting the seed down pretty soon after you've done it if you're really intending to do litter management. So they can create bare soil for seeding. If we're mowing, we want to go ahead and make sure we're removing litter too, using another strategy. And often we saw that people were using grazing, burning, haying, or mowing usually about 2 weeks before an herbicide application to kind of make a space and then allow for regrowth, so they were getting a good contact with that herbicide on those grasses. So there's really two methods of interseeding the actual process. So broadcasting is one, and that might be a situation where you're actually hand broadcasting in a small area or using a fertilizer spreader. There's also drop seeders for bigger areas. In that circumstance, you really need bare soil, so you want to make sure you've got really great litter management. We do recommend cultipacking, so running back over that. That just really helps get a good seed soil contact. And one thing to just think about with broadcast seeding is in some programs, there's some seed rate requirements that go along with broadcast seeding, so you might need to actually double that seeding rate. So just being cognizant of that if you're planning that and what that entails for seed costs and the diversity of seed that you'll be able to lay down. I like broadcast seeding, especially for interseeding, because a lot of those wildflower seeds are really small or they require light to germinate. So if you get those buried, with any depth at all, really, they're not going to do anything. So you've got a nice chance to get those little tiny seeds to germinate if you're doing a broadcast seeding. But a lot of times a seed drill is a more effective method, and there you really want to be able to use a native seed drill where you have the flexibility with different seed boxes, and you can accommodate a lot of different sizes of seed. If you're drilling, you can go into a light stubble layer. I still like to see some kind of litter management. Even a moderate litter layer can really affect how well that seeding does. And you want to make sure those are getting planted a 1/4 of an inch or even shallower if you can, especially for those really small seeds. And it's important to just keep checking that calibration, getting off the drill frequently and making sure you can kind of maybe see some seeds on the surface as you're moving through. And so those are kind of the two seeding methods. The practitioners that we've talked to and we have experience with seeding both in the dormant season and in the spring season, so really anywhere from November to about March, people had success with either of those seasons. What's recommended when it comes to seeding rate is that you do about a 25% increase of the rate you would do if you were doing a complete restoration. So if you were going onto a crop field, take that rate for that species and bump it up about 25% if we're thinking about interseeding. So after we've got that seed down, that first and second growing season are so important for the long-term success of that planting, and we really want to continue, having a hand in that and guiding that forward. Those new seedlings are really vulnerable. They need light, they need moisture, and they need space both above and below ground. So you might want to continue grass suppression, of whatever that dominant grass that you had on site, and time your suppression techniques to match that grass. So, keep doing some form of disturbance in the spring and fall if you've got a cool season grass. The only caveat to this is that you're not damaging those new seedlings. So the only disturbance that we don't want to see in this time period is probably a burn in that first and second growing season. Otherwise, using herbicides, grazing, and haying or mowing really can help the success of this planting. If you want to use an herbicide, we recommend using a grass selective only at this stage unless you're spraying really early in that first spring season to hit those cool season grasses. Also, lighten up that grazing. Make sure you're going out and monitoring to make sure those guys are eating grass and not your new seedlings. You want to continue that invasive weed control definitely in this first year or two. And if you're haying or mowing, just being cognizant of the height of that mowing so that you're not knocking down some of those new seedlings, but instead just catching the grass that's above that. So I think we can go through a couple strategies here in the interest of time, and I want to be able to take questions if you all are, hopefully you all are putting questions in. I think maybe we'll just go through one scenario for each of these grass phenologies. So these were scenarios provided to us by practitioners that were successful for them. And they're all a little bit unique or different situations. So we're talking about a cool season grass stand here, and we'll just go through that one at the top. I think that'll be great. So we've got late summer mow, fall spray, dormant interseed, and then a spring spray following. So this is a situation where I would think you're really having little to no litter issues. Maybe this got burned in the previous year, just not a lot of standing dead remaining. So you're not going to worry too much about litter management. So you're going to mow down that vegetation and then do a fall spray of that regrowth. And that was with a glyphosate just before a killing frost. And then this would definitely be a situation where they probably would use a seed drill if they didn't do any litter management. So go ahead and drill into that light litter layer. And then that spring spray is probably where you want to think about using a grass selective herbicide as opposed to just a non-selective herbicide at all. So that is just a single cool season grass scenario. And I think these are really nice because they can demonstrate the real flexibility that you have with all of these tools. If you don't have the capacity to graze or burn, here's a situation where you can just mow and spray, and you don't need cattle to do it. So I think there's a lot of flexibility, and these are really great at showing you that there's multiple ways to achieve your objectives. Let's look at a warm season grass one too. Let's look at that first one. So we're doing a fall burn followed by a fall interseeding, and then in the next summer we're just doing a high mow or hay. And so this scenario I would say is probably definitely a native warm season bunch grass because we're not seeing a lot of grass depression prior to the interseeding. That fall burn is probably definitely getting some litter management, but we're probably not dinging those warm season grasses. So they're probably got some space in between there for those seeds to do well. That fall interseed probably happened shortly after the burn. And that summer mow or hay that following season, we want to think about keeping that mow probably between 6 to 8 inches high when that vegetation reaches somewhere between 12 and 18 inches. And just maintaining that. Whenever that vegetation gets to 12 to 18, mow it down to 6 to 8. Probably late May through late August would be the time period you would want to think about that. So that would be if you're in a pretty good place to go ahead and interseed. Keep it simple. And the mixed season grass scenarios are really open because there's just a lot of options. Again, we can look at that top one where we're grazing all seasons prior. So by grazing spring, summer, fall, and that season before, we're really hitting those grasses that entire season long and getting some suppression. Hopefully we're also, stocking at a high enough rate that we're getting some litter management there and litter removal. Doing a dormant interseeding. I imagine you could probably broadcast that. And then grazing or haying multiple seasons following that. You might think about grazing intensely for a couple of weeks when our cool season grasses are in the boot stage, and then taking cattle off and then bringing them back on for another intense graze for a couple of weeks when those warm season grasses are in the boot stage to kind of knock back both of those different seasons of grasses moving forward through time. Another thing you could think about is doing cool season grass suppression in year 1, and then in year 2 maybe doing warm season grass suppression and kind of alternating which grass you're hitting year to year to maintain those wildflowers on site. So those are just a few scenarios. There were lots. I'm just going to touch on ongoing management really briefly, and then I'll pass it back to Mace. So really everyone we talked to did ongoing management and advocated for that strongly. And disturbance is really key for these environments. They evolved with disturbance, and they need it to maintain diversity. For that wildlife component, we definitely want to leave that undisturbed refuge, disturbing only a third to a fifth of the site. Pretty much everybody was looking at kind of an adaptive management scheme, so monitoring what was happening and what effects were, and altering what they were doing. Also, they really emphasized varying management type, timing, and location. You know, everybody had a different style and a different method, but they were moving things around every year and trying different things every year. So I think that's really important when you're wanting to keep these wildflowers around. And I think, Mace, I think that's all I have to say about interseeding.
That's great. Excellent. Thanks, Ray. As a reminder, too, for folks, please, if you've got, after sort of listening to that, if you've got questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box. And just to kind of start to wrap things up, one thing I did want to mention, the scenarios that Ray was talking about, we've got these in much more depth in the guidelines that are in development. So I'll circle back to that again one more time. But that is just something to keep in mind if you want to sort of see those other scenarios. They will be available very soon. And really the context for this talk is that interseeding is something that can and is being supported by the Farm Service Agency through the CRP program, as well as NRCS through EQIP, CSP, and the other in the easement programs as well. So whether it's mid-contract management or re-enrollment in CRP, or the application of practices under EQIP or CSP like range planting, conservation cover, upland wildlife habitat management. If you really need to spend focused time and effort on weed management at herbaceous weed control or prescribed grazing, prescribed fire, et cetera, there are a number of practices that can be pulled together into a system to facilitate the conservation planning support and even potential financial assistance to implement interseeding practices on the ground, to take a stand that might be covered in beautiful warm season grasses where the resource concern might be wildflower diversity and pollinator habitat, and really wildlife habitats beyond what can be supported by just a native grass stand. These are the practices that can be brought to bear on that. And as always with NRCS and their collaboration with the FSA as well as with landowners, they're there to provide conservation technical assistance as well. So any farmer or rancher can visit an NRCS field office to get that support. And frequently, that's the NRCS is able to reach out to Xerces or other partner biologists for additional capacity to address some of the questions and CTA requests that come in. Certainly, Xerces is excited to be able to help support that work on the ground. As we look ahead, we mentioned a couple times we've got these interseeding guidelines as well as a brochure that sort of really summarizes at a very high level the take-home messages on the interseeding process. These are just on the cusp of being finished. They're just being final formatting going on, and they need to be reviewed by the Farm Service Agency. But we have a placeholder website here at Interseeding Grasslands for Pollinators where these will be posted when they are done. And we're able to grab all the email addresses for those of you who are listening to the webinar live. And when these get published, we can go ahead and just email the link out to you all, or maybe even send you PDFs at the same time. And as I mentioned, the different scenarios, the different ways that we can tie all these management land prep practices together are all laid out in these guidelines that are going to be coming out. And many of you already know us and our work, and there's a ton of resources available to help in interseeding and well beyond that at xerces.org. And if you go to your NRCS local service center, this is where you can make contact with your Farm Service Agency reps, your NRCS conservation planners and partner biologists, as well as get access to a lot of good information to help in implementing these practices on the ground. So with that, I want to thank the Farm Service Agency for their funding that allowed us to do this work, to pull these guidelines together and deliver this webinar. Thanks again to Sarah, as well as to Richie Ivana for helping to organize this. And as Ray mentioned, thanks to the dozens of folks who really helped us pull these guidelines together and took time out of their busy schedules to answer our questionnaires and talk with us and give us feedback. With that, I think I'll leave it on this slide and we can move over to questions. So far we only have one in, but please feel free to add additional questions. Sarah's going to be elevating them from the Q&A to a question box for us, and I'm just going to dive right in. Josh has a question. In a warm season dominated scenario, are you recommending including native grass species back into your interseeding mix? Or are you assuming that those warm season grasses are only temporarily suppressed and will return, and your interseeding mix is a forb-only mix? That's a great question. Ray, I'm going to have you take that one head on.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Josh, for asking the question. In that scenario, yeah, I would say the grass suppression techniques, if we did an herbicide spray, an intense graze, really any of those management strategies that we talked about, that's really going to suppress those grasses. It's not going to eradicate them from the site. So I would definitely assume that those warm season grasses will return and probably need management in the early years after interseeding, as well as in ongoing management. I would consider including native cool season grass seeds or some sedge species into that mix, but primarily that interseeding mix would be wildflowers. It would be forb species.
Excellent. That's great. Looks like we may have wowed everybody or been so clear that people don't have questions, which is totally fine. We'll wait another minute or so here as people are thinking about it. Nice. All right. Kevin Kuhn asks, really like the information on interseeding techniques. Could you please comment on the difference between interseeding and transitioning? I'm wondering, Ray, is that question clear to you, or should we ask for some additional clarification?
Yeah, transitioning, I guess I'm not sure what that is.
I might, Kevin, if you've got a second to type in a follow-up, that'd be great, but I'm imagining that potentially the difference between interseeding, adding seed to a piece of ground where we're trying to get increased wildflowers versus using management techniques to try to move that cover from, say, more grass-dominated to increasing the abundance of wildflowers, meaning complete transition from cool season community to warm season diverse prairie.
I think there's
Ray,
probably,
what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's probably situations where, the ultimate goal of an interseeding project is going to be to transition a non-native cool season grassland into a, nice warm season diverse grassland. And that's going to be a longer term project. Like I said in the previous question, we're not expecting this preceding management to end up with grass eradication. So if we started with some smooth brome, we're expecting that smooth brome to be back. And so really transitioning into a nice, primarily warm season native grass situation, that's going to be a many years of management would be my thought.
Excellent. That sounds great. Sam's got a question. Do you have any results of actual projects, or an example in this case of an actual project? What do you think, Ray? In your experience, I'm just wondering, in the time available, what your thoughts are on addressing that question.
So we didn't do actual interseeding for this project. We just talked to a lot of people who have. So I think there are certainly examples of successful interseeding in all of those states that we mentioned. We didn't go out and monitor any of those for this project, no.
But certainly the idea was, in talking with these practitioners, we were taking success stories from them and pulling those together into these guidelines.
Yeah, and I think that's interceding, whether it's mid-contract management or a re-enroll on a CRP project is something that many of our biologists do pretty routinely.
All right. Let's see. Kelly, did any of the practitioners have a problem with Sericea lespedeza before trying these practices? And if so, how did they address that issue? Good question.
I don't think anybody was dealing with Sericea lespedeza that we interviewed. I have worked with a couple of landowners with Sericea, and it's difficult, and it's a lot of years. I would say if that's dominant on site, that you're looking at a good at least 5 years of just managing that before you think about interceding. And that's
I think that is
pretty minimal experience with that.
And my impression too is you're probably dealing more with in a way, almost. Actually, this is a question for you, Ray. Would you probably be dealing more then with sort of a whole site, like a start over? Where it's not really a landscape where, quote unquote, interceding is the way forward, but really addressing that weed issue before even trying to come in there to reseed that site?
I think it depends on how much cover you have of Sericea and also what's still on site for native diversity. Once you start managing it, if you're seeing some, rejuvenation of some of those native species and you have a landowner or organization that's pretty dedicated and willing to put in the time and effort to keep managing it, then you might move forward just, keeping it. But certainly there are situations where that would be a, tough one, and maybe you want to think about cropping it or nuking it.
All right. Thank you, Kelly, for that question. Seth's got a long question here. He's managing some pollinator plots for Iowa State University. They're all in second-year growth. Originally were non-native cool season grass, litter removed, mowed in the summer, glyphosate fall. But 80% of that, though, have seen poor establishment with a lot of problematic biennial perennial weeds repopulating the area. So this idea of, he's sort of laid out a fall herbicide application followed by a full fallow season of herbicide applications. It might definitely be necessary. Is this something you've got experience with? So again, sorry, I started at the middle of the question. I just wanted to get the context. So more statement than a question on non-native cool season grass transitions to pollinator habitat. A fall herbicide application followed by a full fallow season of herbicide applications may be necessary. I would agree with that. If it can be. That's almost that start over again scenario. Is this something you have experience with? And I might just quickly take this, Ray. Certainly, Xerces and it's doing demonstration field trials and projects across the country when less in the interceding context and more in the, we've just got a major weed control problem we need to deal with. It's, some of our most successful projects have involved a full season. In some cases, you might even need more of, chem fallow or just keeping those weeds under control and knocked back, really addressing that weed pressure hard and upfront. I think, it's not, you're going to have those scenarios where that's just going to be a requirement if you want to come in and get that diverse pollinator, plant-rich, but also, grass-rich prairie reestablished in a state like Iowa. And then, thinking about problematic biennial perennial weeds, that follow-up management, mowing that second year is the way that we deal with those biennial weeds to knock them back before they set seed, and perennials may need just that spot treatment coming in if they have not been adequately, controlled prior to. So I'm not sure, Ray, if there's anything else you'd add to that.
No.
All right. Kevin's back on deck. What we deal with in CRP, going from CP1. Oh, okay. Kevin's just reflecting back on his comments before in the context of CP1, non-native grass CRP ground, transitioning to a very diverse CP42 pollinator mix. Let's see what Dr. Ray Morantz has to say here. Are there any general characteristics of native forb species that make them good competitors and therefore good candidates for interseeding? Interesting question to you, Ray.
Yeah, I think what you first think of, those plants that are establishing in disturbed areas, fast establishers, kind of competitive, some of those sunflowers producing a lot of seed or reproducing vegetatively. A lot of those species do really well. I was surprised by the list that we came up with of species that people really had success interseeding. There were several species on there that I wouldn't have thought would be great for interseeding, that maybe take a little bit of time, 3 to 4 years to really show up. But, when they with that long view, people were seeing some of those species. So yes and no. I think you definitely want to include some of those things you'll see right away, but it might be worth taking a risk on something that might take a little bit longer to establish, especially if you're going to be continuing to manage the site.
And as a reminder, those guidelines that are coming out have got a list of these species that these practitioners have felt worked really well, for their interseeding projects. And I think we've got those organized sort of west side, east side of the Great Plains, thinking about tall grass versus short grass or mixed grass prairie systems. Thanks, Ray. Dan's got a question. Do you recommend continuous grazing for the entire growing season or high-intensity, short-duration grazing for the growing season prior to interseeding? What do you think, Ray?
I think it depends on your objective. So if you have one of those grass stands with both seasons of grasses, you probably want to think about a continuous grazing system. So you're hitting those grasses, across that entire season. If you are going to do kind of a short duration, high intensity, you just want to make sure you're timing that timing of grazing really, you've got it really tight. When you're in the boot stage for the grasses that you want to hit, and that's when you're bringing them in. I think either could work.
Excellent. And again, it's so much of this, whether it's grazing or grass-selective herbicides, timing is critical. Timing is really a huge part of what leads to success when you've got to hit these things when they're most vulnerable. Clint, let's see, what's the average size of the fields where interseeding projects have been successful for pollinator habitat? In terms of site prep and management, what size projects are landowners willing to tackle? That is a great question for which I don't have a good answer. I don't know, Ray, if you're in your experience in the last year or so in Nebraska, if you've got any good examples. A lot of the practitioners we worked with are folks who are doing this, some with FSA, some on the ground, but many of them were practitioners that were managing private lands at a big scale, folks like the Nature Conservancy or state land managers, et cetera. But any thoughts on this, Ray?
Yeah, I think it's really variable.
I think it comes down to, for somebody who's new to this, I take a pretty conservative approach where if this is a brand new practice for a landowner to take on, I think starting with just a couple acres projects to really try to get their head around the process is important, ideally, and then building up from there, learning from that process. I know that can be frustrating from my perspective. I want to see more habitat on the ground faster, but frankly, I want, it's important for people who are new to this to have success. And so if they can start small, get their head around how the process works, have success, and then be able to expand the scale of that as time goes on. I think that's sort of an important consideration as one thinks about interseeding or any sort of pollinator or biodiversity or wildflower diversity, wildflower conservation. I know we're running a little bit late on time here. I don't know, Sarah, I'd like to, there are a couple questions here that would be so good to get if we can, but I'm wondering, are we able to go a little bit over for those who can stay?
Yeah, I think so, if there's just a couple more that we want to answer. Go ahead.
All right. This next one, in a way, Sarah, might be for you. Since FSA only covers the cost of one practice for mid-contract management, producers are forced to choose between interseeding with no site prep or choosing another mid-contract management option. How can we encourage interseeding with proper site prep when there isn't cost assistance, which is typically a limiting factor for producers? Thank you for this question. Yeah, that's a great question, and something that Xerxes and the partner biologists, Ray, included here, have thoughts and worried about a lot, and really is a policy question for headquarters. Sarah, just to put you on the spot, any thoughts from your perspective on this? Although, any thoughts? Or I have some. Any thoughts from you?
I don't think I have anything at this point.
Okay. I think it is a policy question. Decisions on payment rates on something like mid-contract management is comes down to and is enacted at the state level, but frequently with some guidance and restrictions from headquarters. And so I think it's important for folks to be checking in on this and asking about this. I know, for example, that several years ago, headquarters set aside about $8 million for pollinator-related mid-contract management and wasn't able to use very much of it or see it implemented because the funding per acre, which ranged from $60 to $100, maybe $120 per acre, depending upon the state, really isn't enough to cover the costs of this practice. And part of the goal of this whole project was to try to dig down to say, hey, can we find what is the cheapest, simplest, how can we really get at the most cost-effective way to interseed into these grass stands, especially to try to boost that wildflower diversity for pollinators. And I feel like we really honed down on some of these core techniques, but they're still pretty expensive. The cost of that native wildflower seed for, say, CP42 or the other native practices, the cost and time of the site prep, it's important that these get taken into account. And ideally, as time goes on, we can work to increase, at least for this practice, what's able to be paid out for mid-contract management. So thank you for that question. It's something that's definitely on my mind, as you can tell, that maybe I'll circle back around with Sarah and others at headquarters to talk about. Thanks, Kristen. Let's see. This is good, I think. Can we comment on recommended seeding rate again? I believe FSA in Iowa provides cost share for about 10 seeds per square foot for interseeding, while a new seeding is 40 seeds per square foot. Are the recommendations for interseeding similar? Ray, what's your take?
We didn't talk a whole lot about rate. The one thing was just to up that by species by about 25% of what you would do for, a new planting rate. So when we're talking about seeds per square foot, we didn't really get feedback on that. I will say that 40 seeds per square foot for a new planting is great.
Indeed, and potentially necessary to be competitive if you've got trying to get wildflowers into a stand where you're suppressing maybe some aggressive, even warm season, but certainly cool season grasses to have something that's going to be able to jump up. Let's see, last two questions here. I think we can get them. What maintenance can you do that meets NRCS standards to maintain pollinator stands that we've established, or what practices do you recommend? And in this case, when we've worked on a practice like conservation cover and habitat establishment under conservation cover, when it comes to the establishment period where we do recommend, usually it's mowing or some sort of light grazing to remove any annual or biennial weeds that are still popping up on site, to try to cut those heads off. Certainly before they go to seed is critically important, can help with getting it established. But longer term, those ongoing management practices can be that mix of grazing, spraying, mowing, and haying. We're typically not recommending disking, although it has been used for years in a lot of places, a lot in the south and the southeast, many places to bring back or release wildflowers, some diversity in sites. But the concern that's come up repeatedly in the plain states is that by coming in and disking and opening up that ground, you're potentially opening it up to Canada thistle and any of a number of other invasive weeds. So typically we focus more on the grazing and haying, and then spots treating weeds as we go along. And the last question here is a good one. In fact, oh yeah, great, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to chime in, and I was going to say it actually kind of is in regards to the last question as well. So for those CP42 stands, you can't graze them and you can't hay them. And so really you come down to herbicide sprays and burns, and those are your options. And that's tough. But I mean, as
agree.
much as you can schedule burns, I would say, as much as you can get a landowner to do some maintenance routine burning, I would encourage that. And including herbicides as an option to suppress some of those grasses, definitely is another option. But it's not ideal.
It's not ideal, but there's a little bit of a light, potential light at the end of the tunnel. The Senate and the House have passed their versions of a new farm bill, and the Senate version of the farm bill contains some new provisions that open up the possibility of at least grazing and maybe haying also on CRP if it's being done with the goal of managing for wildflower diversity, wildlife diversity, et cetera. So there are efforts underway to try to open up that that opportunity for grazing to be used on CRP ground in the new farm bill. There, as you all I'm sure are aware, several steps that still need to be walked before that farm bill comes together. The first being conferencing and combining the House and the Senate version. But Josh, that's a great question and something that Xerces is also very interested in and will be looking for because a lot of practitioners, particularly the NRCS folks we work with in the Dakotas, potentially also there in Nebraska, have asked repeatedly, can we just have mentioned, frequently how valuable it would be if we could use grazing as a management tool on CRP ground to affect that disturbance to help maintain these habitats. So keep your eyes open, maybe look for that and the month or two ahead. Yeah, thanks for that question. And again, something that you're not alone in wondering about and that people are working on. So with that, Ray, I just want to say thanks myself to Ray and thanks to Sarah for all of your help and to Manzi who's working behind the scenes to facilitate this webinar. Sarah, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for a great presentation, and thanks for all of the questions and all of the people who stuck around a little bit longer for the discussion. With that, I think we'll close for today. I did have a couple of questions about making the presentation available later. So I noted our website where we put a recording of the webinar, but if it's okay with Mason Ray, we may also see about putting a PDF of the PowerPoint up there as well, because several people requested that.
That would be great. I'm totally happy to put those, to PDF those slides and get them to you, Sarah, to list up there.
Great, that would be excellent. Okay. So with that, I guess we'll hang it up for today, and thanks everyone for joining in, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate you all joining.
Thank you. Please stand by.